All right, so today we're going to be talking about the global industrial revolution, which happened roughly from the late 18th century up through the 20th century. Now, the Industrial Revolution in many ways follows the Atlantic revolutions that we talked about last week, but it is quite different in what kind of a revolution it is. And it's incredibly important to understanding not only the world we live in today, but also the events of the 19th and the early 20th century. European empire, as we'll discuss in the next lecture, could not have happened on the scale it did without industrialization, so this is incredibly important. Now, it's always good to start with definitions. And the simplest definition of the Industrial Revolution is that it was a period of exploitation of inanimate sources of energy like coal and petroleum, and the creation of economies dominated by machines. The Industrial Revolution is the fundamental switch between everything really being done by hand, so clothes being made by hand, baskets, ceramics, etc., to everything being made through machine labor. So this is that big switch in human history that's incredibly important. Now, there are a lot of machines that have an important role here. Here's the spinning jenny, invented in 1764. This device made the production of yarn much faster. That might not seem like a big deal, but textiles, clothing, is going to be the sort of inception point of the Industrial Revolution, the first item that becomes made on this massive industrial scale. And so if you're going to make clothes, it'd be really helpful if you could have yarn and thread made much faster. So the spinning jenny allows for that to happen. We also have the power loom, invented in 1785. This used water to power it, which allowed for the weaving of textiles to go much faster. So this decreases the need for you to hand weave textiles. You also have the invention of Watt's steam engine, which used steam power and ultimately leads to the invention of steam engines that will power trains as well as ships in the 19th century, allowing travel to go faster. Here's an image of a steamship. This will, as I said, revolutionize travel. With steamships, this means people can cross oceans in days rather than weeks or months. It will also ultimately lead to the invention of the railroad, which will fundamentally change travel as well, because it will mean you can travel between land distances much faster than a horse and carriage could go. Now, a little bit of chronology about how this happens. The Industrial Revolution begins in Britain. They are the first to do this. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Industrial Revolution spread in two directions. It spread to the rest of Europe and also to the United States. Now, on the European continent, industrialization was concentrated in only a few places for a while: France, Germany, well, what would become Germany, parts of Austria, not so much Eastern Europe quite yet. By the end of the 19th century, Russia, Japan, and then the rest of Europe began getting in on this industrialization because, as we'll see, it's incredibly lucrative and also funds empire. So everybody's going to want a piece of that. And then in the 20th century, industrialization will become a global event. You have China industrializing in the mid-19th century. Many countries are still working on this. So why is it Britain first? Why not anybody else? Well, there are a few reasons. The first is that in the late 18th century, Britain was in the middle of a population boom, which caused there to be high population density, rural overcrowding, a depression in wages, and a plentiful labor supply. Now, this matters because it means industrialization, factory work, requires a lot of workers. Well, the population boom, you've got a ton of people looking for work. So that's very helpful to Britain. The second is that Britain had already gone through what historians call the agricultural revolution, where new techniques of farming led to high crop yields. So they were doing things like enclosure, fallow fields, crop breeding, using fertilizer. they'd already made this jump forward in agricultural production. So that means they had the food to support this higher population. And absolutely more food also meant that's why the population increased. Now, number 3, Britain also had very good transportation networks. Now, this is before the railroads, so these are all roads for carriages and things. But it's helpful that Britain is such a small island. It means that even though it might take you a little while on foot or horse and carriage, that you can get places fairly quickly compared to, say, China or Russia, which are incredibly large and also didn't have very good transportation network. So when railroads are invented, they simply adapt those rail networks to the transportation network that already exists. So it's going to be very easy to move goods and supplies throughout Britain as they industrialize. And number 4, they also had a sophisticated banking network. Why does this matter? One of the main functions of banks is to lend money, particularly in this case to entrepreneurs, people opening these factories, buying the equipment. So banks, having a banking network was very valuable. Not every country had a solid banking network at this point in history. Britain had national banks at this point, which had enough money to loan it out for these industrial ventures. But interestingly enough, historians have more recently argued that Britain was not the only place that had some of these features. In fact, China and Japan have many of these. So again, we're back to our original question of why Britain? Well, it comes down to 2 things. First, by geographical accident, Britain had a large natural resource in the form of coal, which served as the fuel for industrialization. So burning fuel is what made the machines go. It's what fueled the railroads, etc. And critically, these coal resources in Britain were near their transportation networks and their labor supply. China also had some coal, but it wasn't as plentiful and it wasn't as close to their transportation networks, so not very helpful. The second thing they have is access to raw materials. Some historians have also made the case that Britain's access to raw materials through the Americas and other colonies, especially the money they were making on sugar in the Caribbean, that this all provided an important boost to industrialization, both because of increased income, which then increased investment, and because huge amounts of cotton made people try to figure out how to process it quickly into finished goods. So this is very important. As you industrialize, it's kind of a chicken or the egg almost. As you industrialize, you need colonies. As you need colonies, you need to industrialize. So they're both very important. Now, the problem for Japan is that they are also a small island, so decent transportation networks, but Japan is very mountainous and they don't have a lot of natural coal. So unfortunately, they don't have the fuel to do this at this point in time. And neither China or Japan at this point have colonies from where they can get those resources that they're missing. Now there's some huge impacts of the Industrial Revolution. The first is that the countries that industrialized first gained huge new advantages over the rest of the world. Industrializing areas quickly became engaged in mass production. And if you're involved in mass production, what do you need? Well, you need raw materials like cotton for textiles, timber for construction. Also, increasing urban populations demanded, more food, more grain, right? They're working really hard. So to meet these needs, industrializing nations had to rely on resources outside their own country. So this is going to urge them to go out and colonize more to get what they need. And this is going to be made even easier, particularly by the steamship. Now, since these industrialized areas first had steamships, faster communications, and better weapons, it meant that they could get those raw materials from other places, either through negotiations or, if that didn't work, through force. And this is oftentimes called gunboat diplomacy. So basically taking what you want by sailing your big fancy steamships with their cannons, etc., into a port and saying, hey, if you don't give us what we want, we will bomb your port, and then you really have no choice. So either have the destruction or don't, but the end result will still be the same. Now, this gunboat diplomacy increasingly characterized the ways Britain and other industrialized states approached their relationships with non-industrialized states during the 19th century. And this was because the technological advances gained through industrialization allowed them to get what they wanted, even if it was against the will of another country. So what we begin to see by the middle of the 1800s is a global shift in the balance of power in the world. China will steadily be replaced by European powers because, again, they had industrialized, they're making a lot of money, and they have this power. Remember, before the Europeans had started out very marginal and wanted just to get in on the global markets. Now they're going to be able to dominate those economic markets for the first time in world history. The Industrial Revolution means that now the Europeans have the will to dominate, which they've had for a long time, but now they also have the means to do so. The development of the modern corporation is also an economic effect of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the modern corporation, as we know it today, is one where any number of investors can finance a business venture through the purchase of stocks or shares. And this kind of organization came about during the Industrial Revolution to protect individual investors in the event that the venture went wrong, it went bankrupt, one person wouldn't lose all their money, but that it would also reward them financially if the company did well. So this is kind of spreading out the risk a little bit. And this also means that you can have truly massive business enterprises that control whole industries in any country. And we start to see after this the emergence of the monopoly, because over the 19th century it was not illegal to create a monopoly. And so we see that in the United States, you might think of Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, something like that. So there were huge economic consequences, but there were also huge social consequences and changes. Many things changed socially with the Industrial Revolution. The first of them is the nature of work, namely where you worked and how you worked. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, people generally worked from or near their home. If you're a farmer, right, your farm's right outside your house. If you're a shoemaker or a baker, you lived above your shop. So there wasn't this idea of going to work because work was in the home kind of a thing. But with industrialization, people are going to work. They're leaving where they live and they are walking generally to a factory. So it changes the location of where people work. It also changed the way we thought about time, which sounds pretty crazy when you say it like that, but it did. Farmers, are working sun up to sundown and then some, right? Even bakers and butchers and candlestick makers, they're all working not a 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 shift. They're working as long as it takes to get what needs to be done for the day. When you're working in a factory in the Industrial Revolution, you have to be to work at a certain time, and then you leave at a certain time. And those don't always necessarily coordinate with sun up and sundown. Sometimes you're working the graveyard shift, you're working at night. So this definitely changes the way people think about time. Clocks become much more important. This is definitely before people generally have watches. The wealthy could have afforded them, but not the working class. But again, it changes where people work and how they think about the time that they work. It also begins to change social relations, especially because the Industrial Revolution caused the growth of a working class for the first time. The working class were the people working in those factories. As we'll see, they are the ones that get taken the most advantage of by the Industrial Revolution. And it also creates a working class consciousness of these people kind of bonding together over their shared experience of how difficult this work is. And we'll see how difficult that is in just a minute. Now, it also changed where people lived in terms of population distribution. People began to flock to the cities. For a lot of them, it didn't seem like there was much chance out in rural areas, so they moved to big cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, specifically all in Britain, for the hope of working in a factory, making a better wage, and having a better life. So we do start to see a lot of people funneling out of rural areas and city populations increasing quite a bit. But it also changes the environment. The Industrial Revolution drastically transformed the landscape of Europe and then the rest of the world as other countries industrialized. Industrialization was focused exclusively on extraction, logging for timber, for railway ties, building, mining, intensive food production, coal mining in particular. But also these new industries produced a tremendous amount of toxic waste, most of which was either stored in big heaps near the warehouse or were dumped into rivers and wells, thus contaminating them. Also, these factories, as you can see in the picture, were putting out a tremendous amount of pollution. This is the reason why nobody wears white in the 19th century, because it was pointless. Because if you tried to wear white, you'd step outside and there was so much pollution and ash in the sky that it would literally make your white clothes gray or black if it was really bad. This is also why in the 19th century, a lot of people not opening their windows, because enough of that polluted ash would get in your house anyway. If you open the windows, it's just way more, and then everything in your house is covered in it. There's this old joke about the company London Fog that makes luggage and rain jackets and things, and the joke is that there isn't any fog in London, it's just pollution. Now, London is much better now, it doesn't look like this at all, but this is a parallel problem to industrialization, is that because so much of it's just focused on extraction, no concern about waste or where you dump it or how it gets into the environment, every society that's gone through an industrial revolution has had to deal with this, and China's still dealing with this. China has terrible pollution, but the United States would have had cities who look like this as well. Pittsburgh, Boston, Detroit at various points. So again, this is definitely a very unfortunate outcome of the Industrial Revolution, but one that we still continue to try to deal with today. But perhaps the biggest impact socially of the Industrial Revolution is the human misery that it caused. This is not an easy transition. Now, although the conditions in industrializing countries did improve over time, generally the first 40 or 50 years of industrialization in any country was very difficult for the people who worked in the factories. So even though people tended to make more money working in the factories than on farms, there were a lot of other aspects of industrialization that tended to cancel that benefit out. So factory work does pay better, but these people are living in concentrated urban areas. Now think about this. In the early phases, urban areas grew at phenomenal rates. All of this growth was done without any kind of urban planning or civil engineering to monitor safety or health or to build these buildings to any kind of code. So a lot of slapdash buildings were put up that were hazards in and of themselves, cramming whole families into what would now amount to a studio apartment. And this often meant poor health, bad living conditions, and a real disruption to family life. Here's a picture so you can see these buildings in the 1870s. And this would have been par for the course. The people who owned these buildings were not concerned in upkeeping them at all. But there was so little housing, people had no choice but to continue to live in these conditions. A lot of places had no yards, no toilets, no running water, and either a sewer running through the middle of the street or a common toilet area shared by a whole block. And as you might imagine, this human waste in the streets definitely led to a lot of disease, especially cholera, which is transmitted through diseased water from human waste. In the 1830s, major cholera outbreaks killed 50,000 people in London alone, and hundreds of thousands of people throughout Europe and the United States. Now, how this happened is, as you can see in the picture, that is a well, or a dispenser for the water in the well below it. And these would have been like one of these on every block. Well, if you're throwing your human waste into the street, of course it's going to contaminate that. And then everybody goes there to get their water, and then everybody gets sick. Now, here is a report on the living conditions in 1842 that was done by the government. Now it reads, "Our lodging rooms were such as not to be fit for a swine to live in. In one house there were 16 beds in the room upstairs, and 50 slept in these beds at the same time. There was not a single flag or board on the lower floor, and there were pools of water 12 inches deep. You might have taken a coal rake and raked off the dirt and potato peelings that were 6 inches deep. The breathing at night when all were in bed was dreadful. The workmen received more harm from the sleeping places than from the work. There was one pane of glass which we could open, but it was close to the head of a bed." So this is, pretty horrible living conditions, rather. Again, disease is rampant. Yes, you're making more money than you'd make on a farm, but you're not making enough to get rich, and certainly not enough to move somewhere better. And also, everybody in the family's working. So kids as early as 5 years old are going to work because everybody needs to work to support the family. Now, if living conditions were bad, places of work were rarely any better. There were tons of environmental toxins, no sort of OSHA, no safety regulations, dangers from the machinery, and no protections from your employers until much, much later. Now, in this picture, what you're seeing is the hauling back of a crate of coal. Now, a lot of times in the picture on the bottom, as you can see, that's a woman. Women would be employed because they were smaller in stature than men, so it was a little easier for them to get through the coal shafts. But as you can see, it's way too short for her to stand up. So that's what they would do all day. They would have these harnesses around their waist, and they would go pull these crates of coal back and forth all day long. And you'll be reading an excerpt from some of these women who worked in this job in your reading for this week, and that will give you a little more about how hard this job was. You also have, as I mentioned before, the use of child workers. They're also small, so they're used a lot of times in coal mines as well. But business owners felt that they could pay children less because they were children. A lot of times they were used in textiles because they had smaller hands, which was seen as a real benefit. Here are some children coal miners. So there's no real concept of childhood at this point. There are no child labor laws, that's for sure. But there's no concept that being a child is somehow a protected period of your life. So in conclusion, the first 50 to 60 years of industrialization were incredibly hard on any nation, and the wealthy became so on the backs of the workers. Britain was only able to do this first because of geographical luck and access to colonies, and we'll see how that pans out in our next